Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another fabulous Friday Ramblings. I am your esteemed host, David, aka the Bardic One, and I'm here to once again ramble about all things positive and pop cultural. Because, after all, there's plenty of negativity on the internet, and we want to shine a little bit of spotlight and help brighten your day. And more importantly, because we do have the personal belief here at Roulette Productions that if you're honestly doing something you love, no matter what form of creativity it takes, it's a good thing. It may not be for everybody, but it's a good thing. And we do encourage people to get in touch with their creative side. Speaking of creativity, today we're going to discuss something extremely near and dear to my heart. Something that, as a child, really spoke to me and really helped inspire my personal writings, especially when it comes to crafting characters, especially those with a sense of humor. And that is the iconic and legendary newspaper comic strip, Calvin and Hobbes. That's right, Calvin and Hobbes. The comic strip that pretty much defined 2 decades of cutting edge and yet very family friendly newspaper humor as it ran from 1985 to 1995, straddling the 80s and the 90s, and a lot of cultural changes that came along by doing something very few writers had frankly put the nerve to do. And that is write a comic that existed in a bubble. Calvin and Hobbes, although it would touch on subjects such as environmentalism and general long-standing philosophical ideas in a very light manner, it never really touched on the politics of the time. Which means that the strips, to their advantage, are timeless. Because there's not any real current day references to the humor that make you feel like you have to go back and look that reference up online to remember why it's supposed to be funny. Nope, Calvin and Hobbes exists in a time outside of time. Calvin goes to school, he plays with his best friend Hobbes, most often in the woods next to his house, and that's, makes the occasional, trip for a family vacation. But again, those were always out in the woods. So you can read it in any decade and it feel like it could be relatively present time. And that's one of the great initial strengths of the comic. A lot of comics in newspapers, because newspapers are a very current climate medium, do feel a need to base a lot of their writing and content on what people are talking about at the time. Even Peanuts, which is in many ways the alpha and omega of newspaper comics, felt the need to occasionally draw parallels with what was going on in society in very subtle manners, introductions to new characters who fit certain group representations, just general references to the changing values of the country as it did run for many, 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 many years. And that is, again, not anything that I'm taking away from Peanuts or Charles Schulz. It really is a brilliant comic. As I said, when it comes to newspaper strips, it is the alpha and omega. It is the strip that you measure everything else by. However, to me, when it comes to pure entertainment value, I go with Calvin and Hobbes. Again, part of that is because having been born in 1982, while the strip had been running for a few years, by the time I started reading it, I very much could relate to Calvin. Like the character of Calvin, I was a daydreamer. I was very creative. I loved, just imagining myself being different people in different worlds. You did that as a kid. You played pretend. I just played it a lot more than some kids because I never really fully embraced things like Little League team sports and whatnot. Like Calvin, I was a bit socially awkward. I did not have a huge circle of friends. I had a few, and I would play with them too, here and there. But again, we would usually play games like Play Pretend, Hide and Seek type stuff. Very classic, timeless childhood games. And of course, we'd play the video games too. Hence why I do a lot of nostalgia video game talks. But that's just it. There were things I found in common with Calvin. Now, the big thing about this comic is, of course, the second name here, Hobbes the Tiger. Now, the thing about Hobbes the Tiger, for those people who never read the strips, is that Hobbes represents the entire feel of the strip as a character, in that to Calvin, Hobbes is a living, breathing tiger pal who has his own distinct personality. In fact, most strips involve Calvin and Hobbes either playing off each other in a quirky and humorous manner as their different personalities and values tend to lead to conversations that end in one or both just walking away shaking their head. Some of the best of which are based around Hobbes being a tiger, having a very non-human feline nature. But to the rest of the world, Hobbes is a stuffed tiger toy, a plushie. And Calvin himself seems to, on a couple occasions, make references to that, where Hobbes gets washed in the washing machine instead of, bathing or showering. There being I remember at least one strip where Calvin referenced asking his mom to sew Hobbes up when he busted a stitch due to how rough they played. However, Watterson, in a very brilliant move, never really goes too deep into this dual nature. As he himself quoted in the 10th anniversary book, it's not a matter of Hobbes being magic. It's not a matter of Calvin having the ability to bring Hobbes to life. It is simply, like many other strips that involve Calvin's highly imaginative manner, it's all perspective. To Calvin, Hobbes is a living, breathing soul that happens to be a tiger. To the rest of the world, he is Calvin's imaginary friend. And so, perception is reality. Now, that in and of itself is highlighted by the first couple strips of the entire series, in which Calvin goes out, quote, hunting tigers and laying a tiger trap, which serves as our introduction to Hobbes. Now, for those of you who want to completely embrace the perspective of his parents, we could say Hobbes was a recently bought toy. But for Calvin, he created his own personal origin for how they met. It's neither here nor there. As I said, Watterson does not address it. He simply creates a humorous situation where Calvin goes out claiming he was checking his tiger trap with his father being, of course, a father and very knowledgeable that there are no tigers in suburban America. Kind of laughs it off, with the comic ending seeing the living Hobbes hanging upside down, munching on a tuna sandwich and remarking that tigers are suckers for tuna sandwiches. This, of course, leads to a long-running joke throughout the series that canned tuna is Hobbes' favorite food, and that basically he could eat. Again, it's never explicitly stated. This is my first interpretation that he could eat tuna sandwiches every day of his life and be happy. Hey, again, cat, fish. It's a stereotype. It's a thing. It's freaking hilarious when Watterson pulls that running joke out of his hat. Now, besides those strips, we do have strips involving Calvin going to school, where his socially awkward nature tends to lead to occasionally humorous, sometimes violent reactions with Mo the school bully, a antagonistic but possibly romantic, once they grow up, relationship with local nerdy girl Susie Durkins, who herself occasionally attempts to play with Calvin after school, usually ending with the two of them fighting. Part of the reason for this relationship is that it mirrors Bill Watterson's own. As he describes Susie Durkins, once again, I'm going to reference the 10th anniversary book as it is the greatest source of Watterson's behind-the-scenes mentality. The book, basically that being the purpose for the publication. Watterson himself describes Susie Durkins as the kind of girl that he constantly tormented as a child and eventually grew up to marry. Thus, Calvin's love-hate relationship with Susie Durkins mirrors Watterson's own view of women and the kind of women he likes to have around in his life. Which, again, nothing wrong with that. What's the old cliche? Write what you know. Calvin also had an ongoing antagonistic relationship with his teacher, Miss Wormwood. Calvin at one point remarking after a particular battle of wits, as he enjoys his favorite swing on the playground, that thanks to him, he heard Miss Wormwood is up to 1 pack of cigarettes a day, unfiltered. Of course, these days you can't really make tobacco jokes. Smoking is evil. Okay, that's one of the few times I will say that the humor does date itself a bit, but you know, I'm not going to get into the tobacco is wacko rant. I have my own personal views of it. I think that we've taken this idea of, you know, it's an ugly habit way too far culturally, in that we don't even really like to portray anybody at this point, good or evil, even smoking a cigarette. Heaven forbid anybody good, but, you know, again, that's probably not a rant we'll ever discuss on this show, at least not until I'm really motivated to be really ranty and critical. I try not to do those episodes more than once in a blue moon. And it would be a highly controversial hot button topic anyway. By the way, FYI for reference, I myself have never been a smoker, so any views I have are certainly not highly biased coming from somebody who wished he could smoke in more places more often. Nope, don't smoke, never did, never really appealed to me. So, rewinding back to our main point here. Calvin will also regularly interact with his parents, who remain unnamed throughout the strip's 10-year run. That's right, as I said earlier, it ran for 10 years. This is important. We'll get to that in a little bit. And Watterson himself did address this, stating that the reason he never named Calvin and Hobbes' parents is because he never saw a desire to write a story focusing on them. They were in the comic to serve the role of Calvin and Hobbes' parents, or rather, Calvin's parents. Hobbes doesn't have human parents because he's a tiger, but serves as Calvin's parents. Therefore, they are simply Calvin's mother, Calvin's father. Simplicity in writing. This is a good thing. Once again, when you were writing newspaper strip style things, and the medium does still exist in the form of daily web comics, because you look at any daily web comic and they are the progeny of newspaper comics. Typically 4 panels. You may occasionally get a bit of variety thrown in for the weekend, but hey, again, newspaper strips themselves would have the Sunday full color specials. But the point being that this kind of sequential humor, you want very light world building, a very fine, gentle, light touch to your continuity. You have an ongoing theme, you have your characters and their relationships to each other lined up, but otherwise you simply let things flow naturally in small doses. You want it to feel like something people do not sense they are obligated to check every day, because if they miss one thing, heaven forbid, they might be completely lost for weeks. No, you don't want to do that. It's supposed to be a nice oasis. Now, be me, and having a tiny little bit of a completionist sense to me, which is part of why I have all those. There we go. Yep, all those comics over there. And a few more in alternate storage. Yeah, I've got a bit of a completionist streak. I don't flip in and out of my webcomics and newspaper strips, which is why I have those that Calvin and Hobbes book. I actually have all of the Calvin and Hobbes collections, including the 10th anniversary one. It's simply who I am. You know, I don't like to miss out on anything and that I enjoy. It's also why, again, on a slight side note, personal level, one day we'll have an episode showing off my massive DVD collection. I will never be able to go 100% digital because I like having DVDs. I like having a sense of collection and completionist to it. And then, of course, there's the other thing about streaming and what do you actually own, the subscription models. As I said, that'll be another episode. Probably have to bust out the GoPro for that so I can take our view into the other room where I keep my DVD collection. Think of this as a quick little trailer for promise of future content. But yes, Calvin and Hobbes. One of the other recurring characters in Calvin and Hobbes is Spaceman Spiff, Calvin's alter ego when he decides to go space exploring. Excuse me, little sidebar there. That's what I get for trying to multitask. But Spaceman Spiff is Calvin when his imagination takes him into deep space. This is a recurring way for him to get in trouble with the aforementioned Miss Wormwood, as he never seems to be able to focus in class very long, although he has occasionally found Spaceman Spiff layering over his interactions with his parents. One of my particular favorite strips involved him, Spaceman Spiff, stranded on a desert planet, dying, on the verge of dehydration and starvation. How will he ever survive? And then you see a very large alien bring him snacks and refreshments, only to flash back in reality and see it as his mother bringing him his lunch to the sandbox he was playing in. And that gets back to the earlier theme we had mentioned of duality. He has a love-hate relationship with Susie. Hobbes is both a living being and a plushie, sometimes both at once. Calvin himself often exists in both reality and imagination, whereas with the two highly influencing each other, lending the whole thing to an air of improv that is, for something that you're creating as a writer, extremely hard to pull off. And as I said, Calvin and Hobbes themselves being people with often opposing personalities, even though they are best friends. Hobbes showing a outsider perspective to humans and their habitats as a human level intelligent cat, but also having a more, I don't want to say mature, but generally calmer, more emotionally detached nature, whereas Calvin is impulsive and more prone to excitement and quick to anger. And that is the beauty of the writing. Bill Watterson's greatest strength as a writer, and especially as an artist, with Calvin's daydreams each feeling unique, whether he's Spaceman Spiff, a different one-off character, himself, it all feels unique. The panels of Spaceman Spiff greatly resemble the golden age sci-fi comic books of the decades that Watterson himself grew up in, if not slightly before, and contrasting with the simplistic, cartoonish style of Calvin in reality, clashing again with some of his other one-shot dreams, including a particular Tarzan-inspired one that came off very Hollywood live-action film photorealistic. I mean, as an artist, Bill Watterson was brilliant. He could draw it all, because he did draw it all. This was in the 80s and the 90s. There wasn't computer art programs where you could just, quick add layers and filters, and he did it all by hand, the old-fashioned way. And he did it by himself. He didn't have assistants and a crew. If he had to draw in a particular style, he figured out how to draw in that style to sell the story that he was telling that particular day. And he did it well. And in his writing, he did it well. As I said earlier, one of the greatest strengths of the writing is that everything Calvin does, when his imagination takes over, or when he gets into a battle of wits with Hobbes or Susie or his parents or his teacher, feels improv, feels made up in the heat of the moment. Just like a child would. A child doesn't sit there and pre-plot out particularly, witty things to say should he get in an argument with somebody in the future. Oh, next time my mother tells me to clean up my room, I'm gonna totally tell her this. This is gonna be brilliant. Like, it's so cool. It's so witty. I gotta make sure I remember this one. No, it just comes out. Free flow from brain to mouth with no filter. Why? Because that's how children deal with the world. They haven't learned filters yet. They haven't learned to be responsible and pre-plan. The entire world to them, their entire life is improv. At least everything in life under their control. I mean, there's school and all that structure that adults try to force on a child. But the children rebel because they just want to be in the moment. And Calvin is always in the moment. I'm going to read something real quick. I'm going to quote from the back of this collection. The words of Gary Trudeau, who's another great newspaper comic strip writer / artist. Look him up. Most people who write comic dialogue for minors demonstrate surprisingly little feel for or faith in the original source material, that is, childhood in all its unfettered and winsome glory. It is in this respect that Bill Watterson has proved as unusual as his feckless creations, Calvin and Hobbes. Watterson is the reporter who's gotten it right. Childhood as it actually is. That is why there are people who were born after 1995 when Calvin and Hobbes ended who know the Calvin character, who've gone back and read collections. Why old people like myself still yearn for just one more strip. We just can't find that closure because Calvin is one of the most real children to ever exist in fiction. For 10 years, he was with us every day, representing children that we related to or that we were related to. Even if you didn't act like Calvin, even if you didn't have his intense creativity, you knew somebody who did. Everybody knew a Calvin. The troublemaker, not because he was mean or cruel, because he just lived life in his own personal perspective. He saw the world a certain way, and it just tended to clash with adults. Now, we're getting ready to wrap up real quick because I don't really want to say too much more about Calvin and Hobbes without getting into strip-specific spoilers, and I never, ever, ever give out too many specific spoilers. I've already reminisced about a couple comics, and that's the most I want to do because I want you to seek out these collections. Seek out digital archives of the strips. Go read them if you have never read Calvin and Hobbes. It just... It is right there. It is, as I just... To this day, it still feels modern in the sense of there are still children like Calvin out there. And some of them probably have friends like Hobbes who may or may not exist. But real quick, I do want to mention one other recurring character, and that is the babysitter Rosalind, who is infamous among Calvin and Hobbes fans for being the one person that Calvin always felt like he was an underdog against. That classic babysitter, you know, trying to make a little side money for college, trying to study while, keeping the kid under control. Sorry, a little itchy, as I tend to get. But always manages to stay one step ahead of the kid, no matter what new plot he has. She's never thrown off her game for more than a couple minutes because she is the babysitter, and you will be babysat, whether you like it or not. So by all means, definitely, if you want to check out Calvin at his most antagonistic and bratty, go dig up some strips where he had to be babysat by Rosalind. Now, as for why we're not going to get reunion strips, as for why you're not going to see a Calvin and Hobbes TV show on Netflix, or Calvin and Hobbes movie, because Watterson doesn't care to. One of the great strengths of the legacy of Calvin and Hobbes, and why none of us can move past it 100%, why we will always want a little bit more, is, as I said, he ended after 10 years. For a newspaper strip, I mean, a lot of them, they're just hitting their stride in 10 years. They run for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Heck, the ones that have had different writers and artists take over after the original dies have been running for several decades. Yeah. But Bill ended it when Bill wanted to end it. I'm going to quote from the man himself in an interview he gave in 2010. One of only 2 interviews he has given since retirement. Man's basically a hermit. And I respect him for it. He's living the life he wants to live. Let me see. This isn't as hard to understand as people try to make it. By the end of 10 years, I'd said pretty much everything I had come there to say. It's always better to leave the party early. If I had rolled along with the strip's popularity and repeated myself for another 5, 10, or 20 years, the people now grieving for Calvin and Hobbes would be wishing me dead and cursing newspapers for running tedious, ancient strips like mine instead of acquiring fresher, livelier talent, and I'd be agreeing with them. I think some of the reason Calvin and Hobbes still finds an audience today is because I chose not to run the wheels off it. I've never regretted stopping when I did. And that's Bill Watterson. He ended the strip when he chose to end it. Not when the money stopped flowing, not when he got canceled due to controversy, but when he felt he had told his story to completion. He has refused to bow to pressure, to go back on his word, because he's never regretted it. I mean, I'm sure over the 25 years it's been, God, 25 years, like I just did that math in my head. 25 years since the strip ended. Not to the day, but, round it off. But still, 25 years, I know he's come up with at least one more idea. But he's content with himself. As for why he won't let somebody else do an adaptation, he doesn't believe in it. He doesn't believe in licensing and merchandising. He talks about it in the 10th anniversary book. He feels that when you create characters in a world for the newspaper strip format, that putting out figurines of them, plastering them on t-shirts or coffee mugs, and letting other people write them for movie and TV show format takes away some of the magic, because they were never created for those mediums. And as a fan, I do disagree with him on some level. Like, I would have loved to own an official plush Hobbes. I think every single fan of that comic wanted to own a plush Hobbes of our own. And I definitely, as I said, I would kill for an animated Calvin and Hobbes movie. Especially if Watterson wrote the script. But, as a writer, as somebody who has, over the years, really started to see the strength of stuff ending when it needs to end, when the story is done, and not when the money's dried up, I understand Bill's stance, and I respect him for sticking to his principles no matter what anybody has tried to tell him. Calvin and Hobbes is valuable because there is a distinctly finite amount of it. You have the book collections. As I say, you have, I'm sure, somewhere some digital archives of the strips, but that's what's in the book collections, just minus the forewords and the behind-the-scenes looks in the 10th anniversary book. But that's it. Outside of stuff like this video and other essays and books by fans, as far as official content, that's it. There's no merchandise. There's no spin-offs. There's no sequels. Calvin and Hobbes is only what Bill Watterson felt needed to be written. He created the world. He defined it. He set the borders. And as a fan, as somebody who's to this day still inspired by his writing style, I love him and I hate him for it. Just thank you, Bill. I don't know if he's ever going to see this video in his entire life. I don't know if he even owns a computer. As I said, the man's basically a hermit. But thank you, Bill. Thank you for a character that I'm going to read the rest of my life over and over again and never get sick of. Thank you for being one of the reasons that I write, that I create all of this. Thank you for making a socially awkward kid with a huge imagination find somebody to relate to. See you next week, folks.